The unexpected discovery. Ethan Donovan was a man who seemingly had it all. He was the owner of one of the largest tech companies in the country, his wealth growing with every passing day. Despite his success, he was known to keep a low profile. He preferred solitude over social events, immersing himself in his work to distract from the emptiness that lingered in his life. Wealth, he discovered, could fill your pockets but not your soul. Ethan's rise to fortune was nothing short of remarkable. He had built his company from scratch, working endless nights in a cramped apartment. His relentless pursuit of success had come with sacrifices, most notably his personal life. He had distanced himself from relationships, and more recently, family. His father had passed when Ethan was just a boy, and his relationship with his mother had always been strained. They hadn't spoken in years. His life had become a cycle of business meetings and late-night work, leaving little time for self-reflection. On one chilly afternoon, Ethan decided to take a walk through the city, something he rarely did. His personal driver usually handled his transportation, but today he wanted to experience the world outside of his office. His company was on autopilot for the moment, and for once he felt the weight of his success and loneliness sitting heavier than usual. Walking down the busy streets, he saw families laughing, children running, and people enjoying their day. He couldn't help but feel a pang of regret for how isolated his life had become. As he strolled past a small park, his attention was caught by a group of children playing in a makeshift corner. There were 4 of them, all huddled together, kicking an old deflated soccer ball. They were laughing and joking, despite the state of their worn clothes and scruffy appearance. For a moment, it was their laughter that touched him. But then, something else startled him. He froze in place. His heart pounded, and the world around him seemed to blur. Those children, they looked eerily familiar. It wasn't just a passing resemblance either. As he looked closer, their features became clearer. The sharp jawline, the light green eyes, the tousled dark hair. Each one of them, in their own way, looked like him. His mind raced, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. How could this be possible? Shaking his head, he convinced himself it was just a strange coincidence. Yet he couldn't shake the feeling gnawing at him. He stood still, watching them for what felt like an eternity, until one of the children caught his gaze. A small boy with the same intense green eyes locked eyes with him. A wave of unease washed over Ethan, but he couldn't bring himself to walk away. He approached cautiously, uncertain of what he would say, but as he got closer, his mind filled with questions. Could these children be related to him somehow? It seemed impossible, but the resemblance was undeniable. When he finally reached them, they stopped playing and looked up at him curiously. "Hi there," Ethan said, his voice softer than usual. "What's your name?" He directed the question to the boy who had noticed him first. The boy hesitated for a moment before responding. "I'm Leo." The other children stood beside him, watching Ethan with wide eyes. There were 2 girls, likely twins, and a younger boy who appeared to be the smallest of the group. Ethan crouched down to their level, still unsure of what to say or do next. "Where are your parents?" he asked, his tone gentle but concerned. Leo looked down, his expression suddenly serious. "We don't have any," he muttered, kicking the ball lightly with his foot. Ethan felt his heart drop. These children were out here on their own, with no family to take care of them. He couldn't imagine how that must feel, especially at such a young age. His mind raced through possible explanations. Maybe they were distant relatives, or maybe this was some kind of prank. "Who takes care of you?" Ethan asked, trying to keep his voice steady. Leo shrugged, glancing at the other children before answering. "We take care of each other. That's how it's always been." Ethan's throat tightened. There was something deeply unsettling about the whole situation, but he wasn't ready to leave it alone just yet. These children, as absurd as it seemed, looked too much like him for him to walk away. He needed answers. "Do you know where you came from?" he asked, hoping to get some kind of clue. The younger boy, who hadn't spoken yet, finally piped up. "We don't know. We've just always been together." Ethan took a deep breath. He wasn't the type to act impulsively, but something about this felt too important to ignore. He couldn't let these children stay out here alone any longer, especially given how much they looked like him. Whether they were connected to him or not, he felt an undeniable responsibility toward them. "Listen," he said, his tone softening. "How about I take you all somewhere warm? We can get something to eat, and maybe you can tell me more about yourselves." Leo and the others exchanged glances before finally nodding. With that small agreement, Ethan led the children away from the park, his mind whirling with questions. Who were they? How could they look so much like him? And why did he feel such a deep sense of responsibility toward them? As they walked, Ethan couldn't help but feel that his life was about to change in ways he had never imagined. Unraveling the mystery, Ethan Donovan sat quietly in the corner of a small diner, watching the 4 children devour their meals. He had taken them to this place not far from the park, where the warmth of the diner and the smell of fresh coffee created a comforting atmosphere. The children, who had barely spoken during the walk, seemed to be opening up, though cautiously, once they had food in front of them. The older boy, Leo, kept glancing at Ethan with a mixture of suspicion and curiosity. It was as though he knew Ethan was different from the others they had encountered on the street. But it was the 2 girls, who appeared to be twins, that really caught Ethan's attention. They mirrored each other's every move, as though they shared an unspoken bond. Their strikingly familiar features only deepened Ethan's sense of unease. "So, where are you all staying?" Ethan asked, breaking the silence as the children ate. He was determined to get more information, but he didn't want to push too hard. He needed them to trust him. At least a little. Leo wiped his mouth with the back of his hand, avoiding Ethan's gaze. "We stay wherever we can," he muttered, as though the answer was something he had rehearsed many times before. Ethan frowned. "What about school? Do you go to school?" The younger boy, who had barely spoken since they met, shook his head. "No, we don't go." It was becoming clear to Ethan that these children had been on their own for a long time. The streets had become their home, and survival was their primary concern. But how had no one noticed them? How had they been left to fend for themselves without any intervention? Questions swirled in Ethan's mind, each one more troubling than the last. The twins, who had been whispering to each other, finally looked up at Ethan. One of them, the girl with a small scar above her eyebrow, spoke first. "Why did you come talk to us?" Ethan blinked, caught off guard by the directness of the question. He hadn't expected the children to ask him anything, let alone something so pointed. He hesitated for a moment, unsure of how much he should reveal. "I don't know," he admitted, his voice soft. "Something about the way you looked. It was familiar." The twins exchanged a glance, and the one who had spoken nodded, as though she had expected that answer. "Do you know who we are?" the other twin asked, her voice quiet but steady. Ethan stared at her, completely taken aback. The question was simple enough, but the weight behind it was staggering. Did he know who they were? No, but there was something deep inside him that told him they were connected in a way he couldn't yet explain. It was more than just a physical resemblance. It was a feeling, a strange, unshakable feeling that these children were tied to his past. "I don't know," Ethan said honestly, leaning forward, "but I want to find out." Leo, who had been watching the exchange in silence, finally spoke up. "We've been together for as long as I can remember. The streets are all we've ever known. People usually ignore us, or they just want to help for a day or two and then disappear. But you," he paused, as though weighing his next words carefully, "you look like us." The words hung in the air, heavy and undeniable. Ethan knew it too. They didn't just resemble him. They could have been his younger siblings, or, in a more terrifying thought, his own children. But that wasn't possible. Ethan had never been in a situation where he could have fathered these children. His relationships had been few and far between, and none had ever led to children. Still, the resemblance was too strong to be a coincidence. The diner's warmth began to feel stifling as Ethan's mind raced. He needed answers. He needed to know who these children were, where they came from, and why they looked so much like him. "Do you remember anything about your parents?" Ethan asked, his voice low, almost hesitant. Leo shook his head. "No, we've been on our own since we were little. We don't even know if we have parents." Ethan's heart ached at the thought of these children growing up without any sense of family, love, or belonging. He couldn't imagine what kind of life they had led, fending for themselves on the streets, always looking for the next meal, the next place to sleep. The younger boy, who had been quiet for most of the conversation, suddenly looked up at Ethan with wide eyes. "Do you think you're our dad?" The question hit Ethan like a punch to the gut. His throat tightened, and for a moment, he couldn't speak. Was that what they were thinking? That he was somehow their father? He knew it wasn't possible, at least, not in the way they might be imagining. But the idea still rattled him. How could he even begin to explain the connection he felt to these children when he didn't understand it himself? "I don't know," Ethan said finally, his voice thick with emotion. "But I'm going to help you. I promise." The twins exchanged another glance, and Leo seemed to soften a little. "We've heard that before," he said, his tone guarded. "People always say they'll help, but they never do." Ethan's chest tightened with guilt. He knew what they meant. The world was full of people who made promises they couldn't keep, especially when it came to children in need. But Ethan wasn't like them. He wasn't going to walk away from this. Not now. Not ever. "I'm not like the others," Ethan said firmly. "I'm going to make sure you're taken care of. But first, we need to find out more about where you came from." Leo looked skeptical, but he didn't argue. The twins, on the other hand, seemed more willing to trust Ethan, though their wariness hadn't entirely faded. "I want you to come with me," Ethan continued. "I have a place where you can stay. You'll be safe there, and we can figure this out together." The children were silent for a moment, exchanging looks as though they were communicating without words. Finally, Leo nodded, and the twins followed his lead. "All right," Leo said. "We'll come with you. But if you're lying, we'll leave." Ethan smiled, though the weight of their trust pressed down on him like a burden he hadn't anticipated. "I'm not lying," he said. "I'm going to help you, no matter what." As they left the diner and stepped back into the cold evening air, Ethan felt a strange sense of purpose settle over him. For the first time in years, he wasn't thinking about work or money. He wasn't worrying about his next business move or how to maintain his wealth. Instead, his mind was focused entirely on these 4 children who had appeared in his life like a mystery waiting to be solved. But as they walked through the streets toward Ethan's home, he couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. The real answers, the ones that would change everything, were still out there, waiting to be uncovered. And whatever those answers were, Ethan knew they would shake him to his core. Secrets beneath the surface. The drive to Ethan's estate was quieter than he expected. The children sat huddled in the back seat of his black SUV, their wide eyes peering out the windows at the world beyond, a world that must have felt foreign to them. As they crossed into the wealthier side of town, passing sprawling mansions and perfectly manicured lawns, Ethan couldn't help but notice the children shrinking back into their seats, as though they were suddenly aware of how out of place they were. Ethan's home was a modern fortress of glass and steel, situated on a hill overlooking the city. It was the kind of house that seemed designed to impress, but it was cold, sterile even. It had been a long time since anyone other than Ethan had lived there, and the vast emptiness of the house only mirrored the isolation he felt inside. Bringing these children into his home felt like a strange, surreal twist in his life. But as the gates to his property swung open, Ethan knew this was just the beginning of something he couldn't yet understand. When they arrived, the children hesitated before getting out of the car. Leo was the first to step out, cautiously surveying the surroundings as though expecting it all to be a trap. The twins followed, holding each other's hands tightly. their expressions unreadable. The youngest boy, who Ethan had learned was named Jacob, was the last to emerge, his small hand clutching the edge of the door as he peered up at the massive house. "Is this where you live?" Jacob asked in a quiet voice, his eyes wide with awe. Ethan nodded, trying to make his tone as reassuring as possible. "Yeah, this is my home. You're all safe here. Come inside." The children followed him up the stone steps to the front door, their footsteps hesitant and slow. Once inside, they looked around in disbelief. The high ceilings, marble floors, and expansive living spaces seemed to swallow them up, making them look even smaller and more vulnerable than they had in the diner. Ethan felt a pang of guilt. His wealth, which had once been a symbol of his success, now felt like a barrier between him and these children who had never known such luxury. "This place is huge," one of the twins whispered, her voice filled with wonder. Ethan smiled, though it didn't quite reach his eyes. "It is. You'll have plenty of space to settle in." He led them through the house, showing them the guest rooms where they would sleep. The children were silent as they explored, their expressions a mix of disbelief and uncertainty. For them, this must have felt like stepping into a different world, and for Ethan, it was a reminder of how disconnected he had become from the things that really mattered. After showing them the rooms, Ethan called his housekeeper, Maria, to bring up some fresh clothes for the children. Maria had worked for him for years, and though she had never questioned Ethan's reclusive nature, she seemed genuinely surprised to see him with company, especially children. "Mr. Donovan, should I prepare some dinner for them as well?" Maria asked, her eyebrows raised in curiosity. Ethan nodded, feeling a bit self-conscious. "Yes, please. Something simple, whatever we have on hand." Maria smiled warmly at the children, her maternal instincts kicking in almost immediately. "I'll get started right away." As Maria left to prepare the meal, Ethan turned back to the children. They were sitting on the edge of one of the large couches in the living room, looking small and out of place against the backdrop of his luxurious home. Leo, always the one to speak up first, looked at Ethan with a guarded expression. "So, why are you doing this?" Leo asked bluntly. "What do you want from us?" The question hit Ethan harder than he expected. He understood Leo's suspicion. After all, they had likely been let down by adults their whole lives. But the truth was, Ethan wasn't even sure what he wanted from them, only that he couldn't ignore the strange connection he felt. "I don't want anything from you," Ethan said honestly. "I just want to help, and I need to figure out why you look so much like me." Leo studied him for a moment, then nodded slowly. It wasn't complete trust, but it was a step closer than they had been before. As the night settled in, Maria served dinner in the formal dining room, but Ethan quickly realized the grand setting made the children uncomfortable. They fidgeted with their forks, glancing around nervously, unsure of how to behave in such a formal environment. Sensing their unease, Ethan made a quick decision. "Let's eat in the kitchen," he suggested. "It's cozier." The children visibly relaxed at the idea, and together they moved to the large kitchen island, where Maria had already laid out plates of simple pasta and bread. They ate in silence at first, but soon the children began to talk amongst themselves, their guarded walls slowly lowering as the warmth of the kitchen made them feel more at ease. Ethan watched them quietly, his mind racing with questions. Who were their parents? And why had these children been abandoned on the streets with no one to care for them? He could see the scars of survival etched into their faces, Leo's protective nature, the twins' silent communication, Jacob's quiet demeanor. They had been through more in their young lives than anyone should have to endure. After dinner, as the children settled into their rooms, Ethan retreated to his study. The weight of the day's events pressed down on him like a heavy fog. He sat at his desk, staring at his reflection in the darkened window, wondering what the next step would be. How could he get to the bottom of this mystery? How could these children look so much like him and yet be strangers? His thoughts were interrupted by a knock at the door. He turned to see Leo standing in the doorway, his expression unreadable. "Can I talk to you?" Leo asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Ethan nodded, motioning for Leo to come in. The boy walked slowly to the desk, his hands fidgeting with the edge of his shirt. He looked nervous, but there was something else, something that Ethan couldn't quite place. "What's on your mind?" Ethan asked gently. Leo hesitated for a moment before speaking. "We didn't tell you everything." Ethan's heart skipped a beat. "What do you mean?" Leo looked down at the floor, his voice barely audible. We've been looking for someone who looks like you." Ethan's pulse quickened. "Why?" Leo's eyes met Ethan's, and for the first time, there was no trace of suspicion, only a raw vulnerability. "Because we think you might be him." Ethan's mind raced. What could Leo mean by that? Had someone sent them to find him? Was this some kind of elaborate scheme, or was there something deeper, something more personal? "Who told you to look for me?" Ethan asked, his voice tense with anticipation. Leo's next words sent a chill down Ethan's spine. "Our mother," Leo whispered. "She told us to find the man who looked like us. She said he would know the truth." Ethan's breath caught in his throat. Their mother. He hadn't expected this revelation, and it shook him to his core. The children had a mother, someone who had told them to find him specifically. But why? And what truth was Leo talking about? "Where is your mother now?" Ethan asked, his voice barely steady. Leo shook his head, his face clouded with sadness. "We don't know. She left us a long time ago. But before she left, she told us to find you." Ethan sat back in his chair, his mind spinning. This was more than he had anticipated. The children had been searching for him, on their mother's orders. But what did that mean? Why had their mother sent them to find him? And what truth was she referring to? "I don't understand," Ethan said, his voice tinged with frustration. "Why would she send you to me?" Leo shrugged, his eyes sad. "I don't know, but she said you were the only one who could help us." Ethan's mind reeled with possibilities. Could it be that their mother knew something about his past? Something he didn't even know himself? He had always assumed his life was straightforward, that his success had been the result of hard work and perseverance. But now, with these children in his home, each one a reflection of his own features, Ethan realized that his life might be more complicated than he had ever imagined. There were secrets buried beneath the surface, secrets that these children had been sent to uncover. And Ethan knew, in that moment, that his life would never be the same again. Shadows of the past. Ethan spent the rest of the night in his study, pacing back and forth as Leo's words echoed in his mind. "Our mother told us to find you. She said you would know the truth." What truth could their mother have meant? And how could he possibly be connected to these children? It seemed impossible, yet here they were, 4 children who were undeniably linked to him in ways he couldn't yet explain. His mind flicked through every possible scenario. Could this be some elaborate con? But no, there was no benefit for these children, who had lived on the streets, to orchestrate such a complex scheme. Could he have fathered them unknowingly? That too seemed unlikely, as he had never been in a long-term relationship, and he had been careful during his few brief encounters. And yet the resemblance was so striking that he couldn't brush it off. As the first light of dawn filtered through the large windows of his study, Ethan knew he needed help. He wasn't a detective, and he couldn't solve this on his own. There were professionals who could dig into the children's pasts, uncover their lineage, and perhaps explain the connection that was haunting him. But before he could even think about hiring investigators, he needed to know more about their mother, the mysterious woman who had sent them searching for him. She was the key to all of this. She held the answers. Ethan decided to speak with the children again, but this time he would take a different approach. He had been careful not to pry too deeply into their past the night before, fearing he might push them away if he pressed too hard. But now he needed more details. He needed to know everything they could remember about her. Later that morning, he found the children in the kitchen, eating breakfast that Maria had prepared. They still looked out of place in his massive, modern home, but they seemed a little more comfortable than they had the night before. The twins were whispering to each other as they ate, while Leo and Jacob sat quietly, their expressions unreadable. Ethan sat down across from them, trying to project calm and warmth, though inside he was anything but calm. "I wanted to ask you more about your mother," he began, keeping his voice gentle. "Anything you can tell me about her could help." Leo glanced at the twins before answering. "There's not much to tell. She left us when we were little. Well, when Jacob was still a baby. We were on our own after that." "How old were you?" Ethan asked, his heart sinking at the thought of these children being abandoned so young. "I was maybe 6, Leo said, frowning as he tried to remember. The twins were about 5. It's hard to remember exactly. She didn't talk about herself much, and she was always on edge. Always worried. "Worried about what?" Ethan pressed, leaning forward slightly. Leo shrugged. "I don't know. She never told us, but she was always looking over her shoulder, like she was running from something or someone." Ethan felt a chill run down his spine. Was their mother hiding from someone? And if so, was it someone connected to him? His mind raced with possibilities. Old business rivals, or even someone from his distant family past. But nothing seemed to fit. His life had been focused on his career, and he had never been involved in anything that would warrant someone going into hiding. "What was she like?" Ethan asked, shifting his focus. "Can you remember anything specific about her?" The twins spoke up for the first time, their voices soft and almost in unison. "She had dark hair, like us," one of them said, while the other added, "She had green eyes, like you." Ethan nodded, his throat tightening. "Did she ever mention anyone else? Friends? Family?" Leo shook his head. "No, it was just us. She didn't trust anyone." The room fell silent for a moment as Ethan processed this. The mother had been running, hiding, and yet somehow she had known about him, told her children to find him. But how? And why? Then, almost as an afterthought, one of the twins spoke again. "She used to tell us stories before she left." Ethan perked up. "What kind of stories?" The twin who spoke hesitated for a moment, glancing at her sister before continuing. "They were always about a man who was strong and powerful. She said he was like us, only older." Ethan's pulse quickened. "Did she ever say his name?" The twin shook her head. "No, she never told us his name. She just said that he would protect us if we ever found him. A man who was like them, but older." Could she have been talking about him? Had she known about him all along? It seemed impossible, but the more the children spoke, the more convinced Ethan became that there was a deeper connection between them than he had initially thought. "Do you think that man was me?" Ethan asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Leo looked at him, his expression serious. "I don't know, but she said you would know the truth." Ethan sat back in his chair, his mind spinning. What truth? The only truth he knew was his own past, and as far as he could recall, there were no missing pieces, no hidden children, no mysterious women. His life had been straightforward, if not a little lonely. But now he was beginning to question everything. After breakfast, Ethan made a decision. He needed to dig deeper into the past. There had to be records, hospital files, birth certificates, something that would give him a clue about the children's origins. He also needed to find out more about their mother, the woman who had vanished years ago and left her children with instructions to find him. She was the key to all of this. Ethan made a few calls to private investigators, asking them to look into the children's background. He gave them as much information as he could, which admittedly wasn't much, but he hoped it would be enough to start the search. He also asked them to track down any public records related to their mother, anything that might shed light on where she had come from and why she had been running. That afternoon, as Ethan waited for the investigators to get back to him, he took the children out for a drive around the city. He wanted them to feel comfortable, to know that they weren't trapped in his house. As they drove, They passed through different neighborhoods, some wealthy, some poor, and Ethan noticed how the children's expressions changed as they saw the various parts of the city. It was clear that they had spent most of their lives in the poorer areas, scavenging and surviving. Seeing the wealthier parts must have felt like stepping into another world. "I used to live in a place like that," Leo said quietly as they passed by a rundown apartment building. "Before we were on the streets." Ethan glanced at him, surprised. "Do you remember anything about it?" Leo nodded. "A little. We didn't stay long. She kept moving us around." The mention of their constant movement only reinforced Ethan's belief that their mother had been running from something. But what? Or who? After driving around for a while, they returned to Ethan's home, where Maria had prepared another meal for them. The children seemed to be slowly adjusting to their new surroundings, though they remained cautious, especially Leo. Ethan couldn't blame them. They had been through so much, and it would take time for them to fully trust him. Later that evening, as the children settled down in their rooms, Ethan sat in his study once again, staring at the phone. He was waiting for a call from the investigator, hoping that something, anything, would come up. He needed answers. He couldn't move forward until he knew the truth. Just as he was about to give up for the night, the phone rang. Ethan picked it up, his heart pounding in his chest. "We found something," the investigator said without preamble. Ethan's grip tightened on the phone. "What is it?" "There's no official birth record for the children, but we did find a hospital record from about 10 years ago. It's for a woman named Cassandra Green. She matches the description of the mother you gave us." Ethan's breath caught in his throat. Cassandra Green. The name didn't ring any bells, but it was the first real clue he had. The investigator continued. "She was admitted to the hospital with injuries that suggest she had been running from someone. There's no record of where she went after that, but it looks like she was trying to keep a low profile. We're still digging, but I thought you should know." Ethan thanked the investigator and hung up the phone, his mind racing. Cassandra Green. That was the woman who had abandoned her children and sent them to find him. But who was she running from? And how did she know about him? As Ethan sat in the darkened study, the pieces of the puzzle were slowly coming together, but there were still so many missing parts. He knew one thing for sure. He had to find Cassandra Green. She held the key to everything. The truth, the children's past, and his connection to them. But as Ethan prepared for the next step, a deep sense of foreboding settled over him. This search for the truth would not be easy, and the answers he sought might be more dangerous than he had ever imagined. Into the abyss. Ethan spent the next few days in a state of restless anticipation. His mind was consumed with thoughts of Cassandra Green, the mysterious woman who had seemingly vanished into thin air, leaving behind only fragments of her existence and 4 children who were now living under his roof. The more he learned about her, the more the puzzle pieces refused to fit neatly together. Who had she been running from? And why had she instructed her children to find him? What could possibly connect her life to his? The investigators had provided him with some information about Cassandra's hospital visit a decade ago. She had shown up at a small clinic on the outskirts of the city with injuries that suggested she had been fleeing something or someone. According to the records, she had refused to give much detail, but the attending doctor had noted that she seemed terrified, constantly glancing over her shoulder as if she feared someone might find her. After she left the hospital, she had disappeared without a trace. There were no further records of her, no known addresses, no employment history, nothing. It was as if she had simply vanished. The children, meanwhile, seemed to be settling in. They still didn't trust Ethan completely, but they were warming up to him in small, almost imperceptible ways. The twins, Maya and Lily, had taken a liking to Maria, following her around the house and helping with small chores. Jacob, the youngest, was fascinated by the endless collection of books in Ethan's study and spent hours flipping through picture books, while Leo remained quiet and watchful, always keeping a close eye on his siblings. One evening, as Ethan sat in his study, Sifting through the limited information the investigators had dug up on Cassandra, Leo appeared in the doorway. He was holding an old, worn-out notebook in his hands, his expression serious. "I found this," Leo said, his voice low. "It was in the bag we've been carrying around. It belonged to her. Our mom." Ethan's heart skipped a beat. This could be the breakthrough he had been waiting for. "Can I see it?" Leo hesitated for a moment before nodding and handing over the notebook. Ethan took it carefully, as if the worn leather cover held answers to all the questions swirling in his mind. The pages were yellowed and brittle at the edges, and as he opened it, the faint scent of old paper filled the air. The notebook wasn't a journal, at least not in the traditional sense. It was filled with fragmented thoughts, hurried notes, and what appeared to be cryptic messages. Some pages were covered in drawings, mostly of places that looked unfamiliar to Ethan. Others were filled with words scrawled hastily, some crossed out, others underlined with such force that the pen had almost torn through the paper. It was a chaotic collection of memories, fears, and perhaps clues. "What does it say?" Leo asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Ethan scanned the pages, his eyes catching on one word in particular, repeated over and over again. "Sanctuary." It was underlined several times, and beneath it, a hastily drawn map. It was crude, more like a sketch, but it showed a location in the middle of the city. Ethan didn't recognize it immediately, but as he studied it more closely, he realized it was a rough map of an old neighborhood on the outskirts of town, an area that had been mostly abandoned years ago due to gentrification. "Sanctuary," Ethan murmured, tracing the word with his finger. "Do you know what this means?" Leo shook his head. She never talked about it, but whenever she got really scared, she'd say we had to go to Sanctuary. I always thought it was just something she made up. Ethan's mind raced. Sanctuary. Could it be a place, a person, or was it some kind of code? He wasn't sure, but he knew one thing. This was a lead, and it was the only concrete lead they had. "I'm going to find this place," Ethan said, closing the notebook carefully. "It's the only way we'll get the answers we need." Leo looked up at him, his expression torn between hope and doubt. "What if it's dangerous?" Ethan knelt down to meet Leo's eyes. "I won't let anything happen to you or your siblings, I promise." Leo nodded slowly, but the doubt didn't entirely leave his face. He had lived through too much to trust easily, and Ethan understood that. But this was the only path forward, and they both knew it. The next morning, Ethan made the necessary arrangements. He contacted the investigators, letting them know he had a lead, and asked them to dig into the history of the area shown on Cassandra's map. They promised to follow up quickly, but in the meantime, Ethan decided to visit the location himself. He couldn't shake the feeling that time was of the essence, like there was something lurking just beneath the surface, waiting to be uncovered. He left the children with Maria, assuring them that he would be back by evening. Though they were still cautious around him, the children had grown to trust Maria, and Ethan felt confident that they would be safe in her care. As he drove toward the outskirts of town, where the old, run-down neighborhood lay, a sense of dread settled over him. What was he about to find? The area looked worse than he had imagined. Most of the buildings were dilapidated, their windows boarded up, and graffiti scrawled across their walls. Weeds grew between cracks in the pavement, and the entire neighborhood had an eerie, forgotten feel to it. Ethan parked his car a few blocks away from the location marked on Cassandra's map and continued on foot, keeping his eyes peeled for any sign of life. As he approached the spot indicated on the map, he noticed something odd. Amidst the crumbling buildings, there was one structure that looked maintained. It was an old church, its stone facade weathered but still intact. The stained glass windows, though cracked in places, still glimmered in the late afternoon sun. The word sanctuary was etched into the stone above the entrance. Ethan's heart pounded in his chest. Sanctuary. This had to be it. He pushed open the heavy wooden door and stepped inside. The air was thick with dust, and the faint scent of incense lingered, as though the place had been used recently. The interior of the church was dimly lit, with rows of pews stretching out before him and a grand altar at the front. The only sound was the creaking of the old wooden floor beneath his feet. As Ethan made his way toward the altar, he noticed something unusual, a trapdoor hidden behind the pulpit, slightly ajar. His pulse quickened. What was this place? And why had Cassandra been so adamant about coming here? Without thinking, Ethan reached for the trapdoor and pulled it open. Beneath it was a set of narrow stone stairs, descending into darkness. The musty smell of earth and old stone wafted up from below, and for a moment, Ethan hesitated. But he had come this far. He couldn't turn back now. Taking a deep breath, Ethan descended the stairs, his footsteps echoing off the stone walls. The passageway was narrow and winding, and as he went deeper, the air grew colder, the darkness more oppressive. He fumbled in his pocket for his phone and used the flashlight to guide his way. After what felt like an eternity, the stairs opened up into a large, cavernous room. It was cold and damp, the air thick with an unsettling silence. In the center of the room was a large table, covered with papers, maps, and photographs. Ethan approached it slowly, his heart racing. The photographs were of people, faces he didn't recognize. But among them, one stood out. It was Cassandra. She looked younger in the photo, her dark hair cascading over her shoulders, her green eyes filled with a mixture of fear and determination. But it was undeniably her. Next to the photo was a document, a birth certificate. Ethan's eyes widened as he scanned the information. It was a birth certificate for a child born to Cassandra Green. But what shocked him most was the name listed as the father. It was his. Ethan staggered back, his mind reeling. How was this possible? He had never met Cassandra, let alone fathered a child with her. And yet, here it was, in black and white, the truth he had been searching for. As Ethan tried to process this revelation, he heard a noise behind him, a shuffling sound, like footsteps approaching. He spun around, his heart pounding in his chest. Standing in the doorway was a figure cloaked in shadow. "You weren't supposed to find this," the figure said, their voice cold and sharp. Ethan's blood ran cold. He was no longer alone in the abyss, and whatever secrets lay buried here were far darker and far more dangerous than he had ever imagined. Confronting the truth, Ethan's breath caught in his throat as the shadowy figure stepped into the dim light of the underground chamber. The figure was cloaked in a long, dark coat, their face partially obscured by the hood. The air in the room felt thick and suffocating, as if the very walls were pressing in on him. Whoever this was, they had been watching him, waiting for him to find the hidden trapdoor, to uncover the secret buried beneath the name Sanctuary. His mind raced, trying to make sense of everything. The birth certificate, the photo of Cassandra, the unsettling revelation that his name had been listed as the father of one of the children. None of it made sense. Ethan had never met Cassandra. He had no recollection of being involved with her or fathering any children. And yet the evidence was undeniable. Something had been orchestrated behind the scenes, something that went far beyond what he could have imagined. The figure moved closer, their steps slow and deliberate, the echo of their boots filling the underground room. Ethan's heart pounded in his chest, every instinct telling him to run, but his feet felt rooted to the ground. He forced himself to speak, his voice coming out rough and uncertain. "Who are you?" Ethan asked, his voice echoing in the cavernous space. "And what is this place?" The figure remained silent for a moment, as if deciding how much to reveal. When they finally spoke, their voice was low, almost a whisper, but it carried a weight that made Ethan's skin crawl. "You weren't supposed to dig this deep, Mr. Donovan," the figure said, their tone edged with something that felt like warning. "This was meant to stay buried." Ethan narrowed his eyes, his pulse quickening. "Buried? What are you talking about? I have a right to know what's going on. Who are these children? Why do they look like me?" The figure let out a small, humorless laugh. stepping further into the light. As the hood slipped back, Ethan's breath caught again. This was a woman, older than he had expected, her face etched with lines of hardship and stress. Her hair was streaked with gray, and her eyes, sharp and calculating, seemed to pierce through him. "Cassandra Green was never supposed to find you," the woman said, ignoring his questions. "We thought we'd eliminated that possibility years ago." Ethan's heart skipped a beat. Eliminated that possibility. The woman's words carried an ominous weight. He felt as though he was standing on the edge of something dangerous, something he had unwittingly stumbled into. "What do you mean?" Ethan asked, his voice tense. "Who are you, and what do you know about Cassandra?" The woman sighed, as if tired of keeping up the charade. "My name is Irene. I work for an organization, one that has been operating in the shadows for decades. Cassandra was an anomaly. She wasn't supposed to survive." "Survive?" Ethan's voice faltered, confusion and dread washing over him. "Survive what?" Irene's gaze darkened, her lips tightening into a thin line. "You're involved in this, whether you realize it or not. Years ago, Cassandra was part of a project, one that went wrong. She wasn't the only one. There were others, but we thought we had neutralized all the risks. Clearly, we missed something." Ethan's mind spun. A project? Cassandra? Neutralized? Nothing Irene said made any sense, yet there was a terrifying clarity in her words. They weren't talking about ordinary circumstances. This was something darker, something deeply hidden. "What kind of project?" Ethan asked, though he wasn't sure he wanted to know the answer. Irene crossed her arms, her eyes narrowing. "You were never supposed to be part of this. But it seems Cassandra had other plans. She was desperate, you see. Desperate to protect her children from what she knew was coming. So she did what we never anticipated. She ran. And she made sure her children would find you." Ethan's pulse quickened. "Why me? What do I have to do with this?" Irene studied him, her gaze calculating. "You were part of the same project, though you were unaware. We ensured that. You were selected for your genetic profile, but you were never supposed to be directly involved. Cassandra, however, figured out the truth, and she used it to her advantage." Ethan felt the floor shift beneath him. His genetic profile. Selected. The words were foreign to him, as if they belonged to a story that wasn't his. But somehow, they were. Somehow, this shadowy organization had involved him in something dark and secretive, without his knowledge. And now the consequences were standing in front of him, in the form of 4 children who bore his features. "Are you saying the children are part of some kind of experiment?" Ethan's voice was hoarse with disbelief. Irene's expression remained cold and detached. They were meant to be monitored, not abandoned. But Cassandra was always unpredictable. She took matters into her own hands, and we lost control of the situation. When she disappeared, we lost track of the children. We assumed they wouldn't survive. But here we are. Ethan's hands trembled as he processed what Irene was saying. His life, everything he thought he knew about it, had been manipulated from the start. And these children, the ones he had taken in, were the result of that manipulation. "What did you do to them?" Ethan demanded, anger rising in his chest. "We gave them a future," Irene replied coolly. "A future they wouldn't have had otherwise. But Cassandra was too emotional, too attached to them. She feared what would happen if they remained under our care. So she ran. And now, because of her, you've been dragged into this." Ethan clenched his fists. "These are children, not lab experiments. You had no right to do this." Irene's eyes flickered with something close to amusement. "You don't understand, do you? This isn't just about the children. This is about power, Mr. Donovan. Power that you, too, were a part of, whether you like it or not." Before Ethan could respond, Irene reached into her coat and pulled out a small device, no larger than a cell phone. She held it up, her gaze hardening. "I'm giving you one chance. Walk away. Leave the children with us, and we'll ensure they're taken care of. They'll never be hurt. But if you try to interfere, if you try to expose us, there will be consequences." Ethan's heart pounded in his chest. Walk away. After everything he had learned, after the connection he had begun to feel for the children, the idea was unthinkable. "You think I'm just going to let you take them?" Ethan asked, his voice rising with fury. "After everything you've done to them, after everything you've done to Cassandra." Iron smiled coldly. "You don't have a choice, Mr. Donovan. We have resources you can't even begin to imagine. We control far more than you realize. You've stepped into something much larger than yourself. And if you don't cooperate, you'll be buried with the secrets." Ethan's mind raced, but his resolve hardened. These children were more than just experiments. They were living, breathing people who had been robbed of their chance at a normal life. He couldn't let Irene take them back. He couldn't allow them to be pawns in whatever twisted game this organization was playing. He stood his ground, his voice steady and defiant. "I'm not walking away." Irene's smile faded, her expression turning icy. "You're making a mistake." Before Ethan could respond, the door behind them slammed open, and a group of men in dark suits stormed into the room. They were armed, their faces expressionless, moving with the precision of soldiers. Irene stepped back, her eyes narrowing as she gestured toward Ethan. "Take him," she ordered coldly. Ethan's heart raced as the men advanced. He backed up toward the table, his mind scrambling for a way out. He couldn't fight them. He was outnumbered and outmatched. But he couldn't let them take him either. If he did, he'd never see the children again. Just as one of the men lunged for him, a loud, deafening noise filled the room. The wall behind Ethan exploded in a shower of dust and debris, sending everyone sprawling to the ground. Through the cloud of dust, Ethan saw a figure moving quickly, disarming the men with ruthless efficiency. It all happened so fast that Ethan barely had time to react before the last of the armed men hit the ground, unconscious. Ethan's eyes widened in disbelief as the dust cleared. Standing before him, a woman clad in black tactical gear, her face streaked with dirt and sweat, was none other than Cassandra Green. "You found them," she said, her voice breathless but firm. "Good." Ethan stood frozen, his mind reeling. Cassandra, alive, here, in front of him. The woman who had disappeared, the woman he had been searching for, was now standing before him, a ghost come to life. "We don't have time," Cassandra said, grabbing his arm and pulling him toward the door. "They'll be back." Ethan followed her, his mind struggling to keep up with what was happening. As they raced through the underground passage, the weight of everything, the experiments, the children, Cassandra's return, settled on his shoulders like a leaden cloak. "Cassandra," he gasped as they ran. "What is going on? Why are they after you? Why did you tell the children to find me?" Cassandra glanced at him, her green eyes flashing with something close to regret. "Because you're the only one who can stop them, Ethan. You're the only one who can protect them." They burst out into the open air, the night sky looming above them. In the distance, Ethan could hear the wail of sirens and the hum of approaching helicopters. The organization wasn't done with them, not by a long shot. But for the first time, Ethan understood the gravity of the situation. He had become part of something far bigger than himself, and now, with Cassandra by his side, there was no turning back. As they fled into the night, the full weight of the truth bore down on Ethan. His life had been irrevocably changed, and the children, his children, were counting on him to fight back against the forces that had sought to control them from the start. He didn't know what lay ahead, but he knew one thing. He would stop at nothing to protect them, no matter the cost.